Welcome to Writer. I am Mary Sue Koeppel, the editor of Calliope, and with me today is poet Elizabeth Lund, who is also an editor. And we want to talk to you today about being both a poet and an editor. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Elizabeth, would you spend just a bit of time telling us a little about your background?
Sure. I earned my Master of Fine Arts at Cornell, and then I stayed and taught creative writing for a couple of years. After that, I went to Boston and began working as the poetry editor of the Christian Science Monitor. I've been in that position for almost 9 years. And outside of work, I teach workshops at a local nursing home. I've taught workshops in the public schools, and I also teach a workshop at the women's prison in Framingham, Massachusetts.
And the reason why I wanted you to tell us all of that is because when you came into my class and you gave a workshop for my class, the students couldn't believe that you could have possibly had more experience than they did. So I wanted people to know how really experienced you are. Last night you were giving a poetry reading.
Yes, in Paramus, New Jersey with James Haba,
who is the
director of the Dodge Poetry Festival.
Yes, and you work with kids, K through 12 as well,
yes,
in writing workshops. Elizabeth, with all of that back, plus you've won poetry prizes for your own poetry. So let's talk about being an editor. You are an editor of the Home Forum poetry pages for the Christian Science Monitor. What does that mean?
That's a good question. I receive about 15,000 poems every year, unsolicited, and I read through all of those poems myself, and I choose poems that I think will work for the page. Probably about 50% of the poems that I take can go in as they arrived. In other words, they don't need any help whatsoever. The other 50% do need to be revised at least once. Sometimes that's a matter of changing the title. It may be a matter of clarifying an image or working to make the ending stronger. Sometimes I'll say, the beginning of the poem doesn't work. What if we stop or cut the first few stanzas and start here? This is where the energy really starts to build. Other times it's a matter of saying, I like the idea of this poem, but I don't think you pushed it far enough. Take this through 2 or 3 more drafts and then send it back to me.
So you are a practicing editor in the sense of working with your clients as well as just putting the page together and making those decisions. So do you get on the telephone, you write notes,
I do both. And I see my role as editor not just to put the best poems possible on the page, but to nurture the poets as well.
And what kind of satisfaction do you get from that?
Well, seeing the poems on the page, I guess I have the same reaction that I do whenever I read a good poem. It's that sense of, oh, yes, where you almost hear yourself saying, wow, there's a connection there. There's a sense of discovery. And it's always exciting to see that, even if the poem has gone through many revisions. Once it is finished, it stands on its own. It's a new experience. So I enjoy reading the poems on the page for that reason. I also enjoy working with writers because there's a sense of connection and community. Writing is not just you putting words down on the page. It is you communicating with a reader. And when I'm editing, it's me communicating with another poet. There is a sense of community there, and it reminds me that what we're doing is not just creating an isolated poem, but we are speaking to people. We're letting people know that they are not alone. We're letting people know that the human experience is a powerful, wonderful experience, and that we are all connected to something larger.
Do you see that mission somehow related to the mission of the Monitor?
Yes, to a degree. The Monitor's mission is to injure no man and to bless all mankind. And I think poetry fits into that very well. And on the Home Forum, we have an additional mission to uplift and inspire, but not in any easy, saccharine way. Poems have to be very well crafted, very well wrought. There has to be a sense of wisdom behind the words. But I think in addition to that because I have been a teacher and I have nurtured people in various environments, it's important to me that there be something more than just the paper's mission. I see working with poets as my mission as well.
Elizabeth, the thing that fascinates me is the view that the poet is a witness, and you're almost making the editor the witness as well.
Yes, I think a good editor is a witness. You need to know when to back off. You need to know how to bring out the poet's best voice, how to help the poet get out of his or her own way. And you've got to get out of your own way in that process. Sometimes a poem will come in and I'll think, the way to solve this problem is to do this, is to put an image here or to move this around. But you have to refrain from doing that and instead say, this is what's missing, this is where it needs help, and let the author decide how to do it. Because if you prescribe the solution, you're getting in the way of the poem. You're channeling the poem in directions that it may not want to go in. And when you do that, the poem does not work in the end because it has been diverted into an area that it should not have gone into.
Elizabeth, you also at the Monitor have material on the web,
Yes.
which is not the same as actually appears in the paper.
A lot of it has appeared in the paper. What we have on the website is a section called The Face and Place of Poetry. And we have interviews with poets, we have reviews of poetry books. We also have new material. And one example of that would be interviews I did with 3 poetry editors, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, the editor of Yankee Magazine, and the poetry editor of the New Yorker. Those were all done by telephone. They're audio interviews, and then we had the interviews transcribed so that you can read the interview as well as hear it. But that did not appear in the paper in any form.
When you do these kinds of things, are they because you've come up with the idea to enrich what you actually have on your website already?
Yes, but I think the web has a slightly different mission than the print edition does. And the web is a wonderful way to reach thousands of people. It's a great way to draw in young people. It's a great way to introduce people to poetry. They can hear it. They hear the poet's voice behind it. We have a feature called Poem of the Month, and we publish the poem. You see it on the page, the screen. You also hear the poet reading it, and then you see a bio and a photo, so that the message the viewer gets, hopefully, is that poetry is alive. It's about sound as well as something on the page.
And people who would like to can go to that site and find tips for writers.
Yes.
You have all kinds of sections of... tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I have a section called Put Poetry in Your Classroom. I think that's the title, something like that. And it's really a course in how to teach poetry in your classroom. It's designed for people who may want to do 4 or 5 days of poetry but have never had any experience writing themselves. And it takes you step by step through workshops and imagery exercises. And it talks a little bit about what poetry is and how it works and how you might want to revise with your students. There are also interviews with poets, some very famous. I interviewed Stanley Kunitz last fall, and he is a wonderful, wise man. It was so much fun to listen to him. There is another section with special features, and that would include the interviews that I just mentioned with the 3 poetry editors. There is a section called Poetry in the News, and that has stories about poetry slams, about Emily Dickinson's continued popularity. The section is really in its infancy still. There are probably about 35 items in there now, but I have a lot of ideas for new features.
I can tell. Elizabeth, the reason why I'm asking you to get so specific about it is I'm leading up to the big question of how is the net influencing poetry today, from your experience?
Well, I think the net is a powerful tool because it gets the middleman out of the process, so to speak. And by that I mean that I hear so many people tell me, oh, I've never liked poetry. And I had this high school teacher who made me read it and dissect it because I was smoking in the boys' room. You hear that poetry is being presented as punishment. But what you find on the web is that people have the opportunity to pick and choose what they want to listen to, what they want to read. And they are sitting in front of their computer in the comfort of their own home, and they can experience it without somebody telling them how they should be responding to the work. And I think because of that, people begin to see that poetry is an organic experience. It really is about making connections with other human beings. It's about the excitement of language and what imagery can do. It's about this wonderful art form that works through the mind by first working on the senses. It's the most ancient art form. Poetry arose before any sort of prose. And John Frederick Nims, in his book Western Wind, talks about every culture developing poetry before there is any form of prose, before there's any written language. And he says that in the primitive cultures, people really think that poetry is magic. It is literally magic to them. Today, it's more of a metaphorical magic, but it does bring that sense of suddenly seeing the world in a whole new way. And a good poem will change the way you see yourself and your experience for 24 hours, maybe 24 years.
Which is probably why we go to poetry at very peak experiences. The marriage ceremony, the funeral, the birth announcement, or the baptism, or whatever.
Yeah.
Sure. Elizabeth, we've been talking about your role as an editor, but I know you're the poet, so let's bridge right into your own poem where we see these things happen. Would you mind reading a poem or two for us?
Sure.
I know you have a couple of them there. Great.
I'll read one poem that appeared in the Monitor so that any of your viewers who might want to submit have a sense of what we can and can't do. And then I'll read a darker poem.
Excellent.
Just to give you a sense of my range. On the way home. The flesh of these buildings is gone. The white barn lost its horses. Its dingy house neighbor lost its slow boy. New dwellings crisscross their yards, dead to the past and its echo. Years the child waved to Sam, the horse in the barn's only window. Both knew the language of cats, those ribbons sprawled out in sunshine. Both knew how memory fills the space where you live, and the mind holds everything, always.
And the mind holds everything, always. And what the poet does is
to put that on paper, to make it more permanent, to cherish what the mind has held.
Thank you.
This one is a little darker and grittier. This would not work for the Monitor, but I think every poet has to deal with the various aspects of experience. It's important to record the joy and the warm moments. It is also important to work through the dark moments, because otherwise you really haven't experienced every part of what it means to be human. You haven't really earned the wisdom that poetry needs.
Well said.
Thank you. This one is called Charges, Forest Hill Cemetery. Fog pulls its noose round these sinking vessels. Headstones, castle mausoleums, piloted by drowsy pilgrims, mapless on a rolling sea. Even God's jealous hand can't save them, drawn as they are to these winged women, stone-faced sirens pushed through heaven's trap door. Only one sculpted seraph peers upward, as if she might remember the crooked golden ladder dangling from the edge of sky, the endless invitation out of all this heady wreckage. Row after row of fallen angels, their chiseled cheeks stained black with weeping, graceful arms amputated by slow decay and cracking.
Lovely description. Is this based on a cemetery that's in your memory, or?
Actually, it's based on a cemetery that is about 2 towns over from where I live, and it is the most beautiful place. It's very old, and there are a lot of Catholic sections, and they're wonderful because you see these gigantic angels, and you see sculptures, and it almost looks as though an army of angels was pushed out of heaven and ended up in the cemetery. There's something very peaceful about it, but yet it's also sad to walk through the various rows and you see the black streaks coming down on the faces, and you see where the arms have fallen off. There's a beauty and a real sense of loss at the same time.
Yeah, a great metaphor for what a cemetery is, and the loss and the pain and the tragedy and the beauty of whatever you believe is the end result of death, huh? Elizabeth, what are your major themes?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm working on a manuscript called Eve's Second Apple. And the premise of the book, the first poem actually, has Eve in the Garden of Eden. She has eaten the first bite of the apple. And I've sort of rewritten Genesis a little bit. Instead of being kicked out of the garden, she suddenly begins to lose her memory of who she is. And at the end of the poem, a serpent comes along and whispers to her that if she can only find the other apple, and then the poem ends ... with the implication that if she can find the other apple, she can undo the damage she has done. And then the rest of the manuscript is written from the perspective of a woman who is trying to find her own identity, who is trying to reconnect with her sense of self, trying to find her connection to the world and to the divine. So Eve doesn't find the second apple, but metaphorically the speaker goes on a very long journey to do just that.
Which is every man's journey.
Yes.
To find his identity, who he is. How do you do that in your poetry? Do you create different characters in the search, or do you create scenes in which you reflect?
Every poem works like a scene in a larger story. And the voice is always that of a woman. In some poems she is giving birth, which I've never done. In some poems she is reflecting on childhood experiences. In some poems she is looking at inanimate objects and trying to figure out what their purpose is in the world. But it's a very consistent voice going through a number of different stages of growth. I guess that's how you would say it.
Are these pretty personal? You don't have to answer this if you don't want, but I guess I'm getting at, is this related to the confessional themes of poetry, or?
I wouldn't say the poems are confessional because I place a very high value on craft in poetry, and my work tends to be very imagistic and very tight. I think if there is any element of confession, it comes from the ideas that are behind the poems. It comes from the longing to make sense of things. And the speaker many times is not me, and the experiences that the speaker has oftentimes are so unlike anything I've been through that there is a great deal of fiction there. But what is accurate in each of the poems is the emotional truth, the emotional nugget that I think every writer tries to put in his or her work.
So tell us how you write then, Elizabeth. If you're not writing out of your own experience, but you're writing out of this truth, how do you make the poem?
Well, I think the poem always tells you how it wants to be made. And sometimes you do write from experience and you change things. You let your imagination pull the poem in ways that are very unlike what you actually experienced. Sometimes you do keep very close to the experience itself, but there is always the element of imagination. There is always the element of memory, and we never remember things the way they actually happened. Every person has a different sense of truth. You can talk to 5 people in a family about a certain dinner. Every person will tell you a slightly different tale. But each person is telling you his or her truth. It's his or her emotional truth. So whether I'm writing from imagination or from my experience, it's always the same process, really. It starts with an image, or it starts with a feeling. Oftentimes I visualize my poems almost as paintings. I can see them in terms of color and texture.
What does that mean?
Well, when people imagine their poems, some people will see it as a snapshot. Some people will see it as almost a moving video. I tend to see it in terms of an oil painting. And one image from the poem may be what I visualize, but there is a mood and a tone inherent in that painting, if this makes any sense. And I guess it's the image that starts the whole poem that I try to stick to very closely. And it's funny, there are some poems that I have really had to revise 30, 40, 50 times. There's one poem that took me over 2 years to get it right. And ironically, when I finally did get it to where it needed to be, it was very much like the earliest drafts of the poem.
Because?
Because I think somewhere along the way I tried to tell the poem what it should be doing, instead of letting the poem tell me where it wanted to go. And that's one thing I notice as an editor. A lot of times you'll see a poem that has too many fingerprints on it. The poet has tried to make certain points or has tried to use certain lines that just don't belong there. And when you write a good poem, you're very much like a window pane. The poem comes through you. It is not of you, it comes through you. And you have to know when to get out of its way.
Tell us about how this then is related to what you call craft. Do you work in forms, Elizabeth?
I do. I have a number of sestinas, a number of triolets, a few rondels. I think the only form I haven't been able to do well is the villanelle.
That's a tough one.
I think it's because I just haven't found the right subject matter for it.
Yeah.
There is a certain challenge to forms, and when you find the right subject matter, the form adds a music and a structure and a strength that you wouldn't have had if you were writing free verse. But then again, every free verse poem presents the writer with the challenge of figuring out what is the form, what's the structure, what holds this all together.
And how do you do that? Tips for writers here.
Tips for writers. I think every poet approaches that problem differently. And you have to figure out what your writing process is. For some people, it's a matter of starting with the narrative and just writing until you've gotten the initial inspiration down, and then going back and working with the images, working with the words, working with the line breaks. Other people get most of the poem down the first time, but they have left out some important nuggets, so they go through draft after draft to figure out what that is. Other people know exactly how the poem should be framed, and they can do it in 3 or 4 drafts. I envy people like that, because most of the time I really have to work at my poems. Occasionally one will just fall right in my lap, and that's nice. It's almost an affirmation that yes, all of this hard work is worth it. Have I answered your question?
Yes, I think so. People always want to know how a poet works. How do you work, Elizabeth? Are you someone who dreams poems? Do you write them automatically? Do you write in longhand? How do you work? Let's be just practical for 30 seconds.
Oftentimes, I walk around with the poem in my mind for several weeks or months before I ever get near the page. And I start with an image that is compelling or maybe confusing. There is something about it that I can't quite let go of it. And I think about, why does this intrigue me. I think about what is this image connected with. And sometimes in my poems, I begin with an image and then have to find a narrative to support it. A good friend of mine is the exact opposite. She has a narrative and then has to plug in the images. But I always start with a memory, something that just seems to lodge in my mind and doesn't let me go.
It is time for us to go. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us. This has been Writer to Writer, Mary Sue Koeppel. Thank you.